The ramp of the Higgins boat slammed down into the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima, and all hell broke loose. It wasn't just the sound of gunfire. It was a physical wall of noise and pressure that hit Private First Class Leo Smitty Smith like a fist to the chest. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the roar of Japanese machine guns, the crump of mortars, and the sharper crack of American rifles. Before he even took a step, the man in front of him, a kid from Ohio he'd played cards with just hours ago, was thrown backward, a dark red flower blooming on his chest. "Go move! Get off the beach!" A sergeant was screaming, his voice raw and shredded. Smitty lunged forward, his M1 Garand held high, the churning, ash-like sand sucking at his boots with every step. The beach was a chaotic nightmare of burning landing craft, scattered equipment, and crumpled bodies. The Japanese had the entire landscape zeroed in, from Mount Suribachi to the north, and from the intricate network of pillboxes and spider holes in the rocky terraces ahead. Interlocking fields of fire turned the shoreline into a slaughterhouse. There was no cover. The only strategy was to run, to get off the sand and up toward the first terrace. He dove behind a disabled amphibious tractor, its metal hull pinging as rounds ricocheted off it. He fumbled with his rifle, his hands shaking. He was a rifleman, 19 years old, from Boise, Idaho. His job was simple: see the enemy, aim, and fire. But there was no enemy to see, just puffs of smoke from hidden apertures and the deadly, invisible lines of fire that crisscrossed the beach. He peeked over the tread of the tractor. A Japanese machine gun nest, cleverly concealed in a rocky outcrop 100 yards away, was pinning down a whole platoon. He saw the flash of the muzzle. He raised his M1, lined up the sights as he'd been taught, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle barked, the recoil familiar and solid against his shoulder. He saw a spark near the aperture. He'd hit the rock. The machine gun didn't even pause. He worked the bolt, the spent en-bloc clip ejecting with a distinctive ping. He loaded another, fired again. Another spark. The target was too small, too far, and the stress of the beach was making his aim shaky. He was wasting ammunition. He was following his training perfectly, and it was accomplishing nothing. The machine gun kept firing, and more Marines kept dying on the black sand. This was the brutal reality of Iwo Jima. The Japanese weren't fighting a stand-up battle. They were fighting from deep, fortified positions, using the island's natural and man-made defenses to create a killing maze. The standard-issue M1 Garand, the finest battle rifle in the world, was designed for a more open European war. Here, against pinpoint targets in fortified positions, its limitations were stark. You needed first-shot accuracy. You needed to make every single round count. And the standard-issue sights and the standard training weren't cutting it. A mortar shell landed 20 yards away, the concussion slamming into him and showering him with black sand and shrapnel. His ears rang. As he shook his head to clear it, a thought, born of desperation and a lifetime of tinkering, flashed in his mind. It was a memory of his grandfather, a gunsmith, back in his workshop in Idaho. A simple principle. It's all about the sight picture. Leo. The clearer the picture, the truer the shot. It was a heretical thought. Modifying your weapon was a cardinal sin in the Marines. It was a violation of regulations, a compromise of reliability. But as he watched another Marine cut down, trying to charge the machine gun nest, reliability started to feel a lot less important than effectiveness. He had to get off this beach. And to do that, he needed an edge. He needed a forbidden tweak. The order finally came to move. It wasn't a coordinated assault, but a desperate scrambling crawl up the first terrace, using the craters left by the naval bombardment for cover. Smitty moved with a group of a dozen other Marines, their faces set in masks of grim determination and terror. They reached the relative cover of a rock shelf at the base of the terrace, the volcanic rock sharp and abrasive. The machine gun nest that had pinned them on the beach was still active, but now they were closer, and other units were applying pressure. For the next 48 hours, it was a brutal war of inches. They would clear one spider hole, only to take fire from another. The Japanese defenders were invisible, their positions revealed only by muzzle flashes. Smitty found himself taking snapshots at fleeting shadows and narrow openings. His frustration grew with every missed shot, every ping of an ejected clip that didn't correspond to a dead enemy. During a brief lull, his squad took shelter in a small, reeking cave that had been cleared of Japanese the day before. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, sweat, and something else, something sweet and foul that no one wanted to identify. The men were exhausted, their canteens low, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. Smitty sat with his back against the cave wall, his M1 across his lap. He was cleaning it for the 10th time that day. The familiar ritual a small comfort in the chaos. As he ran the cleaning rod down the barrel, his eyes kept drifting to the front sight post. It was a simple, thick blade of steel, functional. But in the shifting light of Iwo Jima, against dark volcanic rock and shadowed apertures, it was sometimes hard to pick up quickly. His grandfather's voice echoed in his head. A finer sight picture. Leo. He looked around the cave. His eyes fell on a piece of discarded equipment, a broken flashlight from a corpsman's kit. The lens was shattered, but the metal casing was intact. An idea? Clear and forbidden, crystallized in his mind. "Hey, Doc," Smitty said, his voice hoarse. "You're going to need that." The corpsman, a weary-looking man named Riley, glanced at the broken flashlight. "It's junk. Why, just an idea," Smitty said. He retrieved the flashlight and, using his Ka-Bar fighting knife, began to carefully pry it apart. Inside, he found what he was looking for: a small, thin, and remarkably clear piece of glass, the lens. Using the tip of his knife and the edge of a stone, he began the painstaking, sacrilegious work of grinding the glass down. He wasn't making a new sight. He was creating a tiny, improvised aperture, a peephole. Sergeant Henderson, a gruff veteran of Guadalcanal, noticed him. "Smith, what in the holy hell are you doing to that weapon?" Smitty didn't look up. "Trying to see better. Sarge, that's a government-owned weapon. Private. You tamper with it, you compromise it, you know the regulations. You'll get us all killed with a jammed rifle. It's not the action, Sarge. It's the sights," Smitty argued, his voice low but intense. "I can't see what I'm shooting at. I'm wasting ammo. We all are." Henderson knelt down, his face inches from Smitty's. "I don't care if you're trying to turn it into a banjo. Smith, you will not modify your weapon. That's a direct order. You put that thing back together. Marine." The other men in the cave watched the exchange in silence. They all felt the same frustration. But orders were orders. Smitty met the sergeant's gaze for a long moment, then looked down at the tiny piece of glass in his palm. He nodded slowly. "Yes, Sergeant." But later that night, as Henderson took first watch at the cave entrance, Smitty lay in the darkness, the piece of glass a hard, secret weight in his hand. He could hear the sporadic crack of Japanese sniper fire outside. He thought of the men on the beach. He thought of the machine gun nest he couldn't hit. Regulations were written on paper. This war was being fought in hell, He made his decision. He waited until the deep, rhythmic breathing of exhausted men filled the cave. Using a tiny drop of adhesive from a repair kit for his glasses, he carefully fixed the tiny, ground-down glass lens behind the existing peephole of the M1's rear sight. It wasn't a replacement. It was an addition. It was almost invisible, unless you looked closely. But when he tentatively raised the rifle and looked through the sights in the dim light, the difference was immediate. The front sight post was sharper, clearer. The sight picture his grandfather had always preached about snapped into focus with startling precision. It was a tiny change, a forbidden tweak, and it was about to be tested in blood. Dawn on Iwo Jima brought not light, but a gray, oppressive haze. The volcanic dust seemed to hang permanently in the air, coating their lungs and making every breath a chore. Smitty's squad was ordered to advance along a rocky gully that led toward a network of reinforced concrete pillboxes intelligence had labeled the Meatgrinder. The name was apt. They moved in cautious bounds, one fire team providing cover while the other scrambled forward a few yards. The Japanese defense was methodical and ruthless. A single sniper round would crack out, forcing them to hit the deck. Then, a Nambu light machine gun would open up, forcing them to keep their heads down while Japanese infantry maneuvered in the maze of tunnels beneath their feet. Smitty's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. His modified M1 felt alien in his hands, a secret weapon that could either save his life or get him court-martialed. He crouched behind a lava rock, his squad pinned down by the Nambu. The gunner was hidden deep within a narrow firing slit in a pillbox 50 yards away. It was the same problem as the beach, a tiny, deadly target. "Someone take out that Nambu," Sergeant Henderson yelled, his voice tight with strain. A Marine named Cooper tried to rise and fire, but a burst from the machine gun chewed up the rock in front of him, forcing him back down. Smitty took a deep breath, trying to slow his pulse. He shouldered his M1 as he brought the rifle to his cheek. His world narrowed. He looked through the rear sight. The tiny glass lens he had installed worked like a camera's diopter. The blurred edges of the standard peephole were gone. The front sight post was a sharp, black blade against the dark opening of the pillbox. It was the clearest sight picture he had ever seen in combat. He didn't have to think. His training and this new clarity merged into one fluid motion. He exhaled halfway, his finger taking up the slack on the trigger. The front sight settled perfectly in the center of the dark firing slit. He squeezed. The rifle barked. The recoil was a familiar jolt. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, the Nambu fell silent. A collective pause hung over the gully. No one could believe it. "Holy hell, Smitty, you got him," Cooper whispered, his voice full of awe. Sergeant Henderson stared at him, his expression unreadable. He hadn't seen the modification, but he had seen the shot. It was impossible. A 1-in-a-million lucky shot. It had to be. But it wasn't luck. Over the next hour, Smitty proved it. As they inched forward, a Japanese soldier popped up from a spider hole 30 yards to their flank, aiming a knee-mortar. He was exposed for less than a second. Smitty's rifle was already coming up. The sight picture was instant. The front post crisp on the man's chest. Crack. The soldier dropped back into the hole. Minutes later, a sniper fired from a crevice in the rocks 70 yards ahead. The shot went wide, but it revealed his position a sliver of shadow. Another Marine fired and missed, the round sparking off the rock. Smitty settled in, the tiny lens eliminating the visual noise. He saw the slight shift in the shadow, the glint of a scope. He fired a single round. The sniper's rifle clattered down the rocks, 3 shots, 3 kills, all first-round hits, all on targets that others had missed. The men in the squad were now staring at him openly. They weren't just seeing a good shot, they were seeing something unnatural. Sergeant Henderson's initial suspicion had turned into a hard, calculating look. He couldn't prove anything, but he knew. He knew Smitty had disobeyed a direct order. He also knew that disobedience was saving their lives. During the next lull, Henderson moved next to Smitty, his voice low so the others couldn't hear. "That's some mighty fine shooting. Smith?" Smitty just nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Just got a clear view." "Sarge." Henderson grunted, his gaze dropping to the M1's rear sight. He saw it then, the almost imperceptible glint of glass where there should only be metal. He looked back at Smitty's face, then out at the dead Japanese sniper in the distance. He made a decision, the same one Smitty had made in the cave. He clapped Smitty on the shoulder, a rare gesture. "Well, keep getting that clear view. Marine, we need it." The unspoken pardon was given. The heresy was now sanctioned, as long as it worked, and it was working. By the end of the day, Smitty's confirmed kills had risen to 7. He was no longer just PFC Smith. He was the squad's designated exterminator, the man who could solve impossible shooting problems. The forbidden tweak had passed its test, baptized in the fire of the Meatgrinder. The real trial, however, was still to come. The fight for the Meatgrinder had cost them dearly. By the 3rd day, Smitty's platoon was down to half strength, amalgamated with the shattered remnants of another. They were given a new objective hold, a stretch of terrain designated Charlie Ridge, a jagged spine of rock that offered a commanding view of the airfield the Marines were desperately trying to secure. Intelligence suggested the Japanese were preparing a major counterattack to throw them back into the sea. They dug in as best they could, scraping shallow fighting positions in the hard, rocky ground. The stench of death was a permanent fixture, a thick, cloying presence that no ocean breeze could dispel. Smitty found a good position behind a natural rock parapet, with a clear field of fire over a rocky draw that was the most likely avenue of approach. He spent the last moments of daylight meticulously arranging his ammunition. He had scavenged en-bloc clips from the dead, and his bandolier was heavy with them. He checked his rifle for the 100th time. The tiny piece of glass, now his most treasured possession. A secret talisman against the chaos. Sergeant Henderson moved down the line, his face grim. "They're coming tonight," he said, his voice low. "Probably a Banzai. Lots of them. We hold this line. No falling back. You see anything? You kill it." The night fell, thick and absolute. A fine, cold rain began to fall, adding misery to the terror. The Marines waited in their holes, listening. The only sounds were the distant rumble of the naval bombardment elsewhere on the island and the constant, whispering wind. Then the silence broke. It started as a low murmur, a collective intake of breath from hundreds of throats. Then it grew into a chilling, high-pitched scream. "Banzai! Banzai!" A wave of humanity erupted from the darkness of the draw. They were not the disciplined soldiers of the pillboxes. This was a desperate, final charge. Dozens. Then hundreds of Japanese soldiers, some armed with nothing more than bayonets tied to poles, poured out of the night, their faces contorted in frenzy. The Marine line erupted in fire. M1 Garands cracked, bars chattered, and the heavier .30 calibers from supporting positions joined the chorus. It was a shooter's nightmare. Targets were everywhere, but they were shifting, fleeting, and obscured by darkness and rain. Most Marines were firing from the hip, spraying rounds into the oncoming tide, hoping to hit something. But Smitty did not panic. The same clarity that had served him in the daylight now took hold in the chaos. He stayed in his position, his shoulder pressed firmly against the stock of his Garand. He used the tracers from other weapons to illuminate the scene, his modified sight cutting through the visual noise. He became a machine of lethal efficiency. He didn't fire at the mass. He picked individual targets. A sword-waving officer leading the charge. Crack. Down. A soldier carrying a satchel charge. Crack. Charge detonated, taking several others with him. A machine gun team trying to set up a supporting position. Crack. Crack. 2 shots, 2 kills. The ping of his ejected clip was a constant, rhythmic counterpoint to the roar of battle. He worked the weapon with a speed and precision that seemed superhuman. Load, shoulder, acquire, fire. Load, shoulder, acquire, fire. The Japanese charge began to falter as its leaders were systematically eliminated. The mass of soldiers, deprived of direction and faced with this pinpoint, unerring fire from one section of the line, began to bunch up and mill in confusion. They were still deadly, but their momentum was broken. Smitty's world shrank to his sight picture and the fleeting shapes in the darkness. He was no longer thinking. He was reacting. A grenade landed near his position. He shot the man who threw it before the grenade even exploded. Another soldier vaulted over the rock parapet to his left. Smitty swiveled and fired from the hip, the round striking the man in the throat at point-blank range. The fight was a brutal, close-quarters melee that seemed to last for hours but was over in 20 minutes. When the last of the Banzai charge was repulsed, the ground in front of their position was carpeted with enemy dead. The silence that returned was deafening, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the hiss of rain on hot barrels. In the grim light of dawn, a count was taken. The platoon had held. The line was secure, and when they tallied the enemy bodies directly in Smitty's field of fire, the number was staggering. 20. 20 Japanese soldiers, from officers to grenadiers to riflemen, lay dead, most with a single, well-placed .30-06 round in their chest or head. Sergeant Henderson walked over to Smitty's position. The young Marine was slumped against the rock, his face smeared with grime and powder, his hands trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. He looked up at his sergeant. Henderson didn't say a word about the rifle. He just looked at the carnage in the draw, then back at Smitty. He simply nodded, a look of profound respect in his eyes. Good shooting, Marine. The forbidden tweak was no longer a secret heresy. It was a battle-proven fact. PFC Leo Smith, the tinkerer from Idaho, had used his grandfather's wisdom and a piece of broken glass to become one of Iwo Jima's most deadly riflemen, single-handedly breaking the back of a Banzai charge and saving his squad. The story of his lucky shooting would spread through the regiment, a legend born from desperation, ingenuity, and the unwavering will to survive. The morning after the Banzai charge, Charlie Ridge was a landscape from a nightmare. The acrid smell of cordite mixed with the coppery scent of blood and the faint, sweet odor of death. Rain continued to fall, washing the volcanic dust into pinkish rivulets that ran between the bodies. Exhaustion was so profound it felt like a physical weight. Men slept where they had fought, curled in their fighting positions with their rifles still clutched in their hands. Smitty's actions during the night had transcended mere rumor. It was one thing to pick off a few soldiers from a hidden pillbox. It was another to stand firm against a human wave and systematically dismantle it with 20 confirmed kills. The other Marines in the platoon looked at him with a new kind of reverence, a mixture of awe and gratitude. He wasn't just a good shot. He was their guardian, the man who had held the line when it mattered most. Sergeant Henderson made his rounds, checking on his men. When he reached Smitty, he crouched down, his eyes scanning the M1 Garand that lay across the young Marine's lap. The battle was over. But the war of regulations wasn't. That was the damnedest thing I've ever seen. Smith. Henderson began, his voice low and gravelly. You saved this position. You know that, right? Smitty just nodded, too tired for words. Henderson paused, choosing his next words carefully. The company gunny is going to be up here later. He's going to see that, he said, nodding toward the grisly tally in the draw. He's going to ask questions, and if he takes a close look at your weapon, he let the sentence hang. Smitty's heart, which had finally begun to slow, started to hammer again. The pardon Henderson had given him in the heat of battle might not extend to the cold light of day and the scrutiny of a company gunnery sergeant. A court-martial for modifying a weapon was still a very real possibility. The Marine Corps prized obedience above individual brilliance. What do I do? Sarge, Smitty asked, his voice barely a whisper. Henderson was silent for a long moment, his gaze sweeping over the ridge they had held. He saw the faces of the men who were still alive because of Smitty's shooting. He weighed the unyielding code of the Corps against the brutal pragmatism of survival. You do nothing, Henderson said finally. If the gunny asks, you were just lucky. You had a good position. The light was right. You're a hell of a natural shot. You stick to that story. You understand me? Smitty nodded again, understanding perfectly. Henderson was going to cover for him. The heresy would remain their secret. Later that day, the gunnery sergeant did indeed visit the position. He was a hard-bitten veteran with a face like tanned leather. He whistled low as he surveyed the scene in front of Smitty's fighting hole. Who's the sharpshooter? The gunny asked Henderson. Henderson jerked a thumb toward Smitty. PFC Smith. Gunny. Kid's got an eye. Got 20 of them last night. The gunny looked at Smitty, his eyes narrowing. 20 with an M1. That's some fancy shooting. Son. He walked over and picked up Smitty's rifle. Smitty's blood ran cold. The gunny cycled the action, checked the barrel, and then, almost casually, raised it to his shoulder as if to check the sight picture. Smitty held his breath. The tiny piece of glass was right there. The gunny lowered the rifle after a second and handed it back. Sights are a little dirty, he grunted. Keep 'em clean. He clapped Smitty on the shoulder. Good work, Marine. Damn good work. He moved on, and Smitty nearly collapsed with relief. The gunny hadn't noticed. Or, if he had chosen to ignore it. The results on the battlefield had spoken louder than the regulations in the book. The story of Smitty's incredible stand spread through the 5th Marine Division. It was told and retold in hushed tones in foxholes and on supply ships. The official report listed his actions as exceptional marksmanship under extreme duress. The forbidden tweak was never officially acknowledged, but its legacy was profound. In the weeks that followed, a subtle change began to ripple through the ranks. Marines, particularly in Smitty's company, started paying more attention to their sights. They weren't adding glass lenses that was still too great a risk, but they began to blacken their front sight posts with soot, from burnt cork to reduce glare. They spent more time practicing aimed fire, even in the chaos of combat. They had seen what was possible when a rifleman could truly see his target. The lesson wasn't about modifying the weapon. It was about optimizing the interface between the man and his tool. Smitty survived the battle for Iwo Jima, one of the few in his original squad to do so. When he mustered out and returned to Idaho, he never spoke of the piece of glass. He became a machinist, his hands still skilled and precise. He kept his M1 Garand, a trophy of a war he would never forget. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it down from the rack, and his thumb would trace the rear sight aperture. He could still feel the ghost of that tiny lens, a secret that had saved his life and the lives of his friends. The true legacy of his forbidden tweak wasn't in the 20 enemy soldiers he killed. It was in the unshakable belief it instilled in every Marine who heard the story, that in the face of impossible odds, a single soldier, with a little ingenuity and a lot of courage, could tilt the scales. Sometimes, victory wasn't about having a better weapon, but about seeing your target more clearly than the enemy saw you.